There are nights in history that do not announce themselves. No declaration, no formal warning, no press conference. Just a slow, silent rupture. A fracture line opening beneath the foundations of everything a military doctrine was built upon. And by the time the men in the command centers understand what is happening, the damage is already done. This was one of those nights. In the hours before dawn over the eastern Mediterranean, Israel's F-35I Adir, not a second-tier aircraft, not an aging platform struggling to survive in a modern threat environment, but the single most technologically sophisticated combat aircraft ever mass-produced and exported, the centerpiece of the Israeli Air Force's regional dominance strategy, the aircraft that American defense contractors and Israeli procurement officials spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars perfecting, went blind. Not partially degraded, not mildly disrupted, blind. The navigation suites aboard those aircraft, the integrated avionics architectures that synthesize radar returns, infrared signatures, encrypted communications, and GPS positioning data into a single coherent tactical picture, began processing coordinates that were not coordinates. Targeting solutions calculated with mathematical precision against positions that no longer corresponded to the physical world. Strike packages designed to land ordnance within meters of designated targets, releasing weapons that tracked perfectly toward fictional points in space. Pilots operating inside the most advanced cockpit ever built, surrounded by more processing power than entire air forces possessed a generation ago, unable to trust what their instruments were telling them. The missions were aborted. The strike packages dissolved mid-flight. And for the first time in the modern era of Israeli air power, across 7 decades of conflict, across engagements that defined what regional air superiority looked like, across a history in which the Israeli Air Force's ability to reach out and strike any target within 1,000 kilometers had been treated as an almost physical law of Middle Eastern geopolitics, the aircraft turned around. Not because enemy fighters intercepted them, not because surface-to-air missiles rose to meet them, not because any kinetic system reached up from the ground and threatened their survival. They turned around because an adversary reached into their navigation architecture, silently, invisibly, with extraordinary technical sophistication, and made the most expensive weapon systems on Earth impossible to trust. Iran did this, without firing a single missile, without launching a single aircraft, without activating a single surface-to-air battery. Iran did this with electrons. And the question that is reverberating right now through the war rooms of Tel Aviv, through the crisis corridors of the Pentagon, through the planning cells of every major defense ministry that has staked its security on American-built fifth-generation aviation, is a question that does not have a comfortable answer. If Iran can do this to the F-35, the best aircraft we have, what happens next? Tonight, we are going to answer that question. All of it. The how, the why, the architecture behind the operation, the systemic vulnerability that has been hiding in plain sight for years, the reason the IDF's most reliable military instrument just suffered a doctrinal collapse, and what the loss of Israeli air superiority means for this conflict, for American credibility in the region, and for the global balance of military power that has been built on the assumption that GPS-dependent precision warfare is unchallengeable. That assumption died last night, and nothing that comes after will bring it back. To dismiss what happened last night as a tactical setback, a temporary disruption, an electromagnetic footnote in a conflict that will ultimately be decided by other factors, would be to misread an event of historic strategic magnitude. This is not a tactical setback. This is a doctrinal collapse. The distinction matters enormously, and it matters right now, because the implications are not confined to the operational situation over Israeli airspace. They propagate outward through every alliance relationship, every procurement contract, every security guarantee, and every deterrence calculation that has been structured around the assumption that American fifth-generation aircraft are operationally unchallengeable by regional adversaries working under comprehensive sanctions. In Washington, the National Security Council is not having a routine policy discussion tonight. They are managing a crisis of strategic credibility, the credibility of American military technology, the credibility of American export guarantees to allies who bought the F-35 on the explicit or implicit promise that it would be decisive against any regional threat environment. The Pentagon's classified briefings on this event are not using the language of isolated incident or manageable setback. They are using the language that senior defense officials reserve for events that require fundamental reassessment. In Tel Aviv, the War Cabinet is confronting a military situation that the IDF's entire doctrine was structured to prevent, an operational environment in which its primary offensive instrument is unreliable, in which the deterrence architecture that has restrained adversary aggression for decades is visibly degraded, and in which the adversary most responsible for that degradation is watching the results with careful analytical attention and drawing conclusions that will inform its next move. The strategic reverberations extend far beyond the immediate theater. Japan and South Korea, nations whose defense planning is entirely structured around F-35 performance against adversaries with sophisticated electronic warfare capability, are asking questions tonight that their defense establishments were not prepared to answer publicly. Taiwan, whose entire deterrence against Chinese military pressure rests on assumptions about American fifth-generation capability, is recalculating in ways that no official statement will acknowledge, but that every serious strategist understands immediately. The world that existed before this night assumed that GPS-dependent precision warfare was beyond the disruption capacity of sanctioned regional adversaries. That world is gone. Before we go further, this is exactly the kind of analysis that this channel exists to provide. We do not repeat headlines. We do not summarize what you already read this morning. We go into the systems, the doctrine, the architecture, the chain of strategic consequence, and we follow it wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination is for the narratives being managed in Washington and Tel Aviv. If that depth and that honesty is what you came here for, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what is unfolding in this region is not slowing down, and you need to be here for every development as it breaks. Drop your analysis in the comments. The best conversations about events like this happen between people who are paying close attention. Let us know what you think this means for Israel, for the United States, for the future of aerial warfare. Now, let's go inside the machine. Tonight there are 4 questions that cut to the heart of what Iran accomplished and what it means. First, how exactly did Iran execute a GPS denial operation of this sophistication against active F-35 combat missions? And why did no alarm trigger before the damage was done? Second, why is the F-35, the most advanced aircraft on Earth, built by the most expensive defense program in history, fundamentally vulnerable to a capability that a sanctioned nation developed under economic siege? Third, what does the loss of reliable GPS-guided air power actually mean for Israel's military doctrine? A doctrine built entirely on the assumption of rapid, decisive, precision-guided offensive action. And fourth, what is the broader strategic consequence of Iran proving, in live operational conditions, that the cornerstone of American military power projection can be neutralized by an adversary investing in the right domain? The electromagnetic spectrum. 4 questions, 4 answers, all of them uncomfortable, none of them avoidable. Let us begin. The operational result was identical to air superiority denial through kinetic engagement, without the political consequences of shooting down an F-35, without the escalatory trigger of a direct kinetic attack on Israeli aircraft, and with the added strategic dividend of demonstrating a capability that every defense ministry on Earth is now urgently studying. This capability did not emerge overnight. It did not emerge from a lucky reverse engineering project or a single intelligence windfall. It is the product of a decade-long, deliberately structured, strategically patient development program, and understanding its origins is essential to understanding why Western intelligence consistently failed to anticipate its operational maturity. The foundation was laid in 2011. That year, Iranian forces captured an American RQ-170 Sentinel reconnaissance drone, not destroyed, not recovered in pieces, but captured almost entirely intact. The United States government initially claimed the drone had malfunctioned and crashed. The explanation collapsed within weeks when Iranian engineers demonstrated they had guided the aircraft to a soft landing on Iranian soil by executing a GPS spoofing attack against its navigation system, causing the drone's autopilot to believe it was approaching its home base in Afghanistan, while it was in reality being vectored to a prepared landing site inside Iranian territory. This was not luck. This was a technically sophisticated attack against American GPS receiver architecture, executed with sufficient precision to defeat the signal authentication protocols aboard a military-grade navigation system. What the captured RQ-170 gave Iranian engineers was irreplaceable. Direct access to American GPS receiver design, the signal processing logic, the authentication threshold parameters, the specific fidelity requirements that military GPS receivers used to validate incoming positioning signals. Iranian reverse engineering teams extracted every technical insight available from that platform. What they learned informed an entire generation of electronic warfare development within the IRGC's Electronic Warfare Command over the following decade. The system they built is not a single jamming device. It is a layered architecture operating across multiple modes, deployed from mobile platforms, designed specifically against the GPS signal protocols used in American and Israeli military systems. At its core, a high-power spoofing transmitter network operating in the L1 and L2 GPS frequency bands, the precise frequencies used by military-grade receivers aboard the F-35. Iranian engineers developed a signal generation capability that produces spoofed transmissions with timing accuracy and structural fidelity sufficient to defeat military GPS receiver authentication. This is not simple electronic interference. This is precision signal fabrication, manufacturing false reality at the speed of light. The spoofing capability is complemented by an integrated suite of supporting systems. The Mersad and Kashef radar families, developed indigenously across the past decade, provide detection and tracking capability against low observable targets, including aircraft with reduced radar cross-sections like the F-35, on frequencies and waveform designs specifically chosen to exploit gaps in the F-35's radar warning receiver coverage. When Israeli F-35s entered Iranian electronic warfare coverage zones, they were not invisible. They were being tracked by systems engineered to see them, while simultaneously being fed false GPS data that degraded their ability to respond. Iran navigated its own systems with precision, using GLONASS and Beidou satellite navigation rather than GPS, insulating its own targeting and positioning from the denial environment it was creating over Israeli airspace. The asymmetry of that situation on an active battlefield is almost impossible to overstate. One side of this engagement possessed full positional certainty. The other side was flying through electromagnetic fiction. The mobile deployment architecture is what makes this capability so operationally durable. The transmitter platforms are mounted on heavy military transport vehicles, constantly repositioned, operating on pre-planned emission schedules that limit their detectable signature windows to minutes at a time. Israeli signals intelligence attempting to geolocate an active spoofing transmitter has consistently found that the platform has relocated before a strike mission can be planned and launched against it. This cat-and-mouse dynamic has been playing out for months. Iran has been winning it. What makes the capability still more dangerous is its scalability and its redundancy. This is not a fixed installation vulnerable to a single precision strike. It is a distributed, mobile, self-healing network that can lose individual nodes and maintain operational effect across the coverage zone. Destroying one transmitter shifts the coverage map marginally. The strategic outcome, a degraded GPS environment over Israeli operational airspace, persists. The sanctions narrative that Western governments constructed around Iranian military capability, the confident assertion that economic isolation would prevent Tehran from developing sophisticated military technology, has been operationally refuted. Not in a laboratory, not in a test environment, in live combat conditions against the most advanced aircraft the United States has ever exported. Iran built this under sanctions. Iran refined it under sanctions. Iran deployed it under sanctions. And it worked. The question of why Israel's defenses, and more broadly why the entire American-architected fifth-generation air warfare system, proved vulnerable to this attack, is a question that requires confronting a pattern of institutional failure that runs deeper than any single intelligence miss or procurement decision. The foundational failure was one of assumption. Western defense analysis across more than a decade of evaluating Iranian electronic warfare development operated from a premise that was never rigorously tested against evidence because it was never rigorously questioned as a premise. The assumption was this: a nation under comprehensive economic sanctions, denied access to Western microelectronics, cut off from international defense procurement channels, simply could not develop the signal processing sophistication and the electronic engineering depth required to threaten fifth-generation GPS-dependent systems. This assumption was not based on evidence. It was based on technological arrogance. The RQ-170 capture in 2011 should have destroyed this assumption. It did not. American and Israeli intelligence communities processed the event, acknowledged its significance in classified assessments, and then proceeded to underestimate the rate at which Iran would translate that initial insight into operational capability. The classified threat assessments produced over the following decade consistently lagged behind Iran's actual development pace, not because Iranian engineers were doing anything theoretically impossible, but because the analysts writing the assessments were anchored to a framework that could not accommodate the possibility of Iranian success at this level. The architectural vulnerability of the F-35 itself compounds the intelligence failure. The F-35 program's dependency on GPS is not an oversight or a developmental compromise. It is a deliberate design choice that made enormous sense within the threat environment assessed at the time of the aircraft's conception, an environment in which GPS denial capability at the level Iran has now demonstrated was not considered a credible near-term adversary capability. GPS-guided precision munitions allowed the F-35 to achieve targeting effects with smaller, lighter weapons, reducing the aircraft's payload weight and allowing more of that payload capacity to be allocated to fuel and sensors. GPS-dependent navigation allowed more accurate flight path planning, more reliable low-altitude strike profiles, more precise coordination between networked aircraft in a strike package. Every decision that created the GPS dependency made the F-35 more capable within its designed operational envelope. The problem is that operational envelopes change, and the defense acquisition cycle that produces aircraft like the F-35 operates on timelines measured in decades, not years. By the time the F-35I Adir reached operational deployment with the Israeli Air Force, the threat environment had evolved significantly beyond the one the aircraft was optimized to face. But the doctrine had not evolved. The training had not evolved. The operational assumptions embedded in Israeli air campaign planning had not evolved. The saturation dimension of the failure is equally important. Israel's GPS receiver vulnerability extends across the entire force, not just F-35s. Every GPS-guided munition in the IDF inventory, every navigation system on every aircraft that uses GPS as a primary input, every ground-based system that relies on GPS timing signals for communication synchronization, all of it operates within the same vulnerable signal architecture that Iran targeted. The operational effect is not limited to F-35 strike missions. It propagates across the integrated joint warfare architecture that makes Israeli military power work as a coordinated system. The processing limit dimension reveals the deepest failure of all: the failure to account for the adversary's decision-making time advantage. Spoofing attacks work precisely because they defeat the authentication logic before that logic can flag an anomaly and alert a human decision-maker. By the time any human in the Israeli command chain understood that GPS data was compromised, multiple weapons had already been released against false targets. The system had failed before the failsafe could activate, not because the failsafe was broken, but because the failsafe was designed against a different category of threat. The assumption that Washington and Tel Aviv maintained for a decade, that Iranian electronic warfare capability was a future concern, a developing threat, a problem to be managed in the next procurement cycle, was the most operationally consequential intelligence failure in the current conflict. It is not a future concern anymore. What happens when the foundational assumption of a military alliance cracks? When the weapon system that was supposed to be the guarantor of security turns out to carry a systemic vulnerability that an adversary has already exploited in live combat? The answer is not a single event. It is a cascade, and that cascade is now in motion. In Washington, the first and most urgent consequence is the collapse of a procurement narrative that has driven American defense exports and alliance relationships for nearly 2 decades. The F-35 program was sold to Congress, to allied governments, to the American public, not merely as an aircraft, but as a strategic guarantee. Purchasing the F-35 meant purchasing a capability advantage so decisive that adversaries would be deterred from challenging it. The program's political survival through decades of cost overruns, development delays, and technical failures was sustained by that guarantee. That guarantee has now been operationally challenged in the most public and analytically documented way possible. Japan, which operates F-35s as its primary response to Chinese and North Korean air and missile threats, is asking questions tonight that the Japanese Ministry of Defense was not prepared to answer publicly. South Korea, which has built its air defense architecture around F-35 strike capability against North Korean infrastructure, is reassessing quietly, but with urgency. Taiwan, whose deterrence depends fundamentally on assumptions about American and allied air power performance against Chinese military action, is recalculating in ways that no official statement will acknowledge. The international defense procurement market for American fifth-generation aircraft faces serious turbulence. When allied governments ask their defense establishments whether the aircraft they purchased performs as described in the GPS-contested operational environments they will actually face, the honest answer is now considerably more complicated than it was before last night. The deterrence dimension is the most strategically consequential. American deterrence in the Middle East, the capacity to deter adversary action through the credible threat of precise, overwhelming military response, is built on the operational effectiveness of American and allied air power. Every adversary calculation about the cost of escalation includes an assessment of what Israeli and American air assets would do in response. That calculation just changed. Not because Iran destroyed a single aircraft, but because Iran demonstrated that the precision strike capability at the heart of allied deterrence can be degraded through electronic warfare without a single kinetic exchange. From Beijing to Pyongyang to Moscow, defense strategists are not celebrating. They are doing something more dangerous. They are studying, adapting, and planning. Russia's electronic warfare program is more advanced than Iran's. The operational lessons from Iranian GPS denial against F-35 combat missions will be incorporated into Russian doctrine for potential conflict in European theaters with a directness and a speed that NATO planners should find sobering. Moscow does not need to develop new capabilities based on what Iran demonstrated. It needs to refine and deploy capabilities it already possesses at greater scale and against a more complex adversary. China's investment in GPS denial, electromagnetic spectrum warfare, and anti-access architecture has been massive, sustained, and strategically focused on exactly the operational concept that Iran just validated. Every Chinese defense analyst reviewing the events over Israeli airspace last night is confirming a thesis that Chinese military planning has been built around for a decade, that American GPS-dependent power projection is the decisive vulnerability in any high-intensity conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and that the investment required to exploit that vulnerability is a fraction of the investment required to match American carrier aviation platform for platform. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on American military equipment predicated on the assumption of American technological decisiveness. That assumption is in active review in Riyadh and Abu Dhabi tonight. The back-channel conversations between Gulf capitals and Tehran that have been ongoing at low intensity for months are intensifying as regional leaders reconsider the wisdom of complete strategic alignment with an alliance whose military technology guarantee has just been visibly challenged. The energy market dimension adds a global economic consequence to the strategic calculus. Every basis point increase in Middle Eastern risk premium, driven by demonstrated Iranian operational effectiveness, translates directly into higher energy costs for every importing economy on Earth, with all the inflationary, political, and economic destabilization consequences that flow from sustained energy price elevation. The options available to Israel and Washington in the aftermath of this engagement are real. None of them are clean. Every single one carries a cost that the governments involved are reluctant to publicly acknowledge. The first option is technical remediation, accelerating the fielding of anti-jam GPS receivers, multi-source navigation systems, and spoofing detection algorithms aboard Israeli F-35s. Some of this work is already in the pipeline. Emergency prioritization can compress timelines. Anti-jam systems using directional antenna technology can maintain GPS signal lock against jamming. Navigation architectures that cross-reference GPS against inertial systems and terrain reference positioning can detect spoofed signals by identifying inconsistencies between data sources. This option provides partial restoration. It does not provide full restoration. The spoofing detection systems that can identify GPS compromise still require additional onboard computing, introduce their own processing delays, and impose operational limitations on the seamless precision that Israeli air campaign planning has relied upon. More fundamentally, Israel now knows that Iran can target its GPS architecture, and Iran knows that Israel knows. The operational planning changes required by that mutual understanding are extensive, slow to implement, and cannot be compressed by any emergency acceleration program into a timeline that matches the current operational pressure. The second option is kinetic suppression, direct airstrikes against Iranian electronic warfare infrastructure. This is the option that strikes the most obvious strategic logic and carries the most serious escalation risk. Iran's mobile deployment architecture makes this option far less effective than it appears. Striking mobile transmitter platforms that relocate on pre-planned schedules requires persistent ISR coverage and strike response timelines that the current operational environment does not consistently support. More critically, escalating to direct airstrikes against Iranian territory, even against electronic warfare assets rather than nuclear infrastructure, crosses a threshold that changes the conflict's character in ways neither Washington nor Tel Aviv has currently chosen to accept. Every escalatory choice in this direction carries costs in diplomatic capital, in allied cohesion, in domestic political sustainability, and in the risk of Iranian responses that expand the conflict into domains, Hormuz, Gulf energy infrastructure, American bases in the region, that the current strategic posture is not prepared to absorb. The third option is doctrinal adaptation, restructuring Israeli air campaign planning around platforms and munitions less dependent on GPS guidance. Older F-15 and F-16 aircraft using different navigation architectures can absorb some of the strike mission burden. Inertially guided and terrain-referenced munitions can replace GPS-guided systems for certain target categories. But these adaptations sacrifice the precision, the stealth, and the sensor fusion capability that the F-35 provides, and they impose a permanent operational cost on a military that was built around different assumptions. The deepest consequence of all is this. Even if Israel successfully restores F-35 operational effectiveness through technical remediation, even if Iranian electronic warfare nodes are eventually degraded through sustained operational pressure, the knowledge that this capability exists and has been successfully employed in combat conditions is irreversible. Iranian engineers know they succeeded. They know the specific signal parameters, the emission schedules, the coverage geometries, and the timing sequences that produced the operational outcome last night. That knowledge does not disappear. It informs the next generation of Iranian electronic warfare development. It informs Iranian doctrine for every future engagement in which Israeli air power is a factor. And it informs the strategic decisions of every other actor who is watching Iran's performance and drawing conclusions about the accessibility of GPS denial as a military instrument. The winner of last night's engagement, if that word can even apply to an electronic warfare operation in which no kinetic exchange occurred, has entered a world where the technology it used to achieve its result is permanently part of the threat landscape, where every future adversary will have studied its methods, and where the assumption of uncontested GPS availability that made its military power so effective will never be restored to the certainty it once carried. There is no scenario in which the events of last night do not matter deeply, for a long time, in ways that extend far beyond Israeli airspace. History does not knock. It does not announce itself with sirens or headlines or emergency broadcasts. It moves quietly through the systems that nations depend on. through the navigation signals that carry aircraft to their targets, through the electromagnetic assumptions embedded in the most expensive weapons programs ever created. And when those systems fail, when those assumptions break, the world that existed before the failure does not reassemble itself on the other side. What happened over the Middle East last night was not a tactical incident. It was not an electronic warfare experiment that produced interesting data for future analysis. It was a strategic event of the first order, the kind that gets studied in war colleges for generations, the kind that rewrites procurement priorities and alliance calculations and deterrence doctrine across years of institutional reckoning with what changed and why. A nation that was supposed to have been economically strangled into strategic irrelevance, sanctioned, isolated, denied access to Western technology and Western capital and Western markets, reached out last night across hundreds of kilometers of contested airspace and made the most advanced combat aircraft on Earth unable to execute its assigned missions. It did so without firing a single shot. It did so with technology developed under siege, refined through patience and strategic clarity, and deployed at precisely the moment and against precisely the target that maximized its political and military impact. The age of GPS-dependent aerial supremacy, the age built on the confident assertion that precision-guided munitions and fifth-generation stealth aircraft had made certain categories of adversary challenge permanently obsolete, did not die in an explosion. It did not die in a dogfight. It dissolved quietly in the electromagnetic spectrum, victim of a strategy that identified the dependency, invested in the counter, waited for the right moment, and then executed with precision that the systems it targeted could not match. The F-35s will fly again. Emergency technical programs are already in motion. Classified threat assessments are being rewritten. Procurement timelines are being accelerated. All the institutional machinery of correction is engaging, as it does when events of this magnitude force recalibration. But the myth, the foundational strategic myth that American technological supremacy in the aerial domain was unchallengeable by sanctioned regional adversaries, the myth that structured security guarantees and alliance relationships and deterrence calculations across 3 decades, that myth is gone. And no technical fix, no emergency procurement program, no diplomatic initiative will restore it to the certainty it carried before last night. The questions that matter now are the ones that do not yet have comfortable answers. Has Iran permanently changed the operating assumptions of aerial warfare in the Middle East? And if so, what does Israeli security look like in an environment where its primary offensive instrument cannot be fully trusted? If a sanctioned nation with a fraction of America's defense budget can neutralize GPS-dependent precision warfare in live combat conditions, what does that mean for American deterrence credibility in every other theater where adversaries with greater resources are watching and learning? And most fundamentally, are we witnessing the opening move of a new kind of warfare, one fought primarily in the electromagnetic spectrum, where the nation that can shape the signal environment controls the battlefield, regardless of how many aircraft the other side has? Leave your most important thoughts below. Share this analysis with someone who needs to understand what actually happened last night, not the version being managed for public consumption, but the one playing out in the classified briefings and the crisis corridors where the real reckoning is beginning. Subscribe, stay sharp, stay informed, because the next development in this story is already unfolding, and you need to be here when it does.